The thing with Labour is because it's such a self-righteous kind of movement, they just kind of assume that if the nice people are in charge, then nice things will happen.
We've got to get some of these animal spirits back and enthusiasm for what you can do with your life. It's just been closed off and people are kind of giving up, and it's so depressing.
It's such an awful time to be on social media with these people, just moaning like crazy, and none of it happened. I'm not saying it's all been a success, but there have been some successes from it. I think on balance, it's been a good thing, actually.
Hello and welcome to this very special, festive edition of Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every damn episode by Chris Snowden from the IEA. How you doing, Chris?
Season's greetings to you, Tom. And to all our viewers / listeners.
Absolutely, and huge season's greetings to returning guest, Lord Frost, unaffiliated peer, and also the incoming Director General of the IEA, so soon to be Chris's new boss. So be on your best behaviour. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Looking forward to Christmas, looking forward to the new job, looking forward to fighting the fight.
So we've got plenty to discuss here, but before we do that, I've got a very exciting announcement to make, which is a new Spike book. Brendan O'Neill, he's done it again. Vibe Shift is the new title that we're going to be launching in the new year. And if you want to get your hands on a signed copy, you need to donate to our Christmas campaign. Anyone who gives £50 or more to us this Christmas will get their hands on a signed copy of Vibe Shift. And if you're a Spike supporter, someone who donates to us already, you can get one for £30 or more. If you want to make your donation to fund our work to go into New Year and also to get your hands on one of these, just go to spiked-online.com/Xmas. That's spiked-online.com/Xmas. We want to kind of take a look back on the year, I guess, of this Labour government from a pro-liberty perspective and just work out, how much damage we think, I guess, this government has done so far and where we think the politics of everything might be moving next. We probably should start with the economy, though, not least because you're both from the Institute of Economic Affairs, not least because we just had the budget the other week. David, this government came in saying it had a laser-like focus on growth. As part of that budget, the OBR's projections suggested that growth is going to be downgraded in every year towards the end of this decade. Obviously, it's the OBR, so you might as well just throw darts at the wall and draw a line between them. But nevertheless, it's still indicative of the fact that it's not going great guns where the economy is concerned. What was your kind of main takeaway from the budget and where this Labour government has left us economically?
Well, in a mess, obviously. I mean, one has to laugh at this laser-like focus on growth.
It's haunted than that quote, isn't it? Definitely.
Yeah, I just don't know what their view of growth is at all. I think they think it's some sort of magical substance like phlogiston in the 18th century or something, something that's just kind of there in the air. And if you get lucky, you get some of it. And I just feel they don't really understand what makes an economy grow, how you try and set up incentives so people, kind of have an interest in working, how you get the tax burden down, how you get a smaller state, all this, all the empirical evidence that says smaller states, lower tax burdens, lower spending produces economic growth and prosperity. They seem completely indifferent to this, but I don't really know what their alternative is other than just to hope growth kind of turns up somehow. And so far it hasn't.
No, absolutely. And on the sort of question of what this Labour government could do, I mean, they did come in with some suggestions that even people more on right of centre politics or of a more libertarian persuasion were quite keen on. They were talking about trying to do something about the planning laws. They were talking about essentially trying to create the conditions for growth. What happened to any of that agenda as far as you can tell?
I mean, the planning law, the planning bill is still going through. As far as I can tell, it started off possibly not too bad within the range of the possibilities. So it's got watered down as it's gone through. And really, it is really about making the existing system kind of work harder. It isn't really about reform and change. I mean, I have written kind of welcoming it, even so, because it is still a step forward. But I can't really think of anything else that they've done. Everything else. I mean, there's a lot of terrible stuff they inherited from the Tories, like the Renters Reform Bill and the Tobacco Act and all this sort of rubbish. But add to that the employment bill that's soon going to become law. None of this helps growth, and I just don't know where they think this is coming from.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Chris, is there anything you want to chuck in on the economics?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. They don't understand what growth is. I don't think they're alone in this. I think most governments just keep their fingers crossed. And the thing with Labour is because it's such a self-righteous kind of movement, they just kind of assume that if the nice people are in charge, then nice things will happen. And they did get it. I agree that they got it with the planning, because everyone been going on about it for 10 or 15 years. It wasn't even a left-right issue, the fact that we need to be able to build more, not just houses, but all sorts of things. But when push comes to shove, the government will give in to single-issue pressure groups and their backbenchers. And the single most important event of the year, and possibly of this parliament, was when Labour were unable to get their welfare reforms through, because that was the point at which you saw a relatively minor and perfectly sensible reform being overthrown because of Labour backbenchers and a few vocal, single-issue pressure groups. At that point, I think it was clear that for the rest of this parliament, we are going to be run essentially by the Labour backbenchers. At some point, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will get kicked out in favour of somebody who the Labour backbenchers prefer. In other words, someone who's more left-wing and therefore even worse. And the prospects for growth or a good economy died that day, along with the prospects of any kind of fiscal continence. And the budget was all about, as I said in an earlier podcast, pleasing the core constituency of the Labour Party, which basically welfare claims and public sector workers and Labour backbenchers. And unfortunately, I don't think there's any way back from that. I think things are just going to get worse and worse, because you can say you've got a laser-focused, whatever, you're laser-focused on growth, or whatever the cliche is. But the reality is, you mentioned the Employment's Right bill. There was something in the Telegraph a while ago saying that this bill, along with lots of other crazy stuff that's going to deter anyone from employing anybody, you're going to get a week off if your distant cousin dies. That is clearly not a growth-focused policy, but there will always be somebody saying, oh, I had a distant cousin, and actually I was much closer to her than you might think. I was actually really gutted when they died. Why don't we extend this to dead pets as well? There's always some sob story behind these things that turns out to be more important than growth. And we're planning the plight of newts or bats will always turn out to be more important than growth, unless you genuinely do have a laser focus, which is to say ruthless focus on growth.
Totally. I mean, I completely agree. I think the welfare vote was so important because it showed that spending is never going to go down. The only way they can show any kind of discipline and keep the markets sort of at least vaguely happy is to increase taxes. And, we know what comes with that. So, as you say, everyone can see it's only going to get worse. The trend over the next few years is just worse. Everyone can see that. That's why people are leaving. That's why people are making their plans accordingly. And I don't see why it's going to get any better with this philosophy.
Especially with those welfare reforms, which, if memory serves, I've kind of mercifully forgotten a lot of that period, is the fact that this wasn't about radically reducing the welfare spend. It was just clipping the rate at which it was going to increase. And even they can't get that past the Labour backbenchers. And even when I think there is a pretty strong moral argument that you can imagine a kind of more sensible or previous generation of the Labour Party understanding, which is that it's not only unsustainable, but also there's a tremendous moral cost to having large sections of the population put out to pasture, huge rise in sickness benefits amongst young people, almost purely since the pandemic, something which hasn't been reflected across other countries. You would think that a version of that argument could land, but without at the risk of personalising this, David, too much. Have you been struck by how bad a fist Rachel Reeves in particular has made of all of this? Because she's emerged from this year quite a weakened figure in the country, if not amongst the Labour backbenchers who now seem to be running the show.
Yeah, she really has, I think. And, some of it comes down to, I think, not being, totally connected to the centre of gravity of the Labour Party and what the party kind of really thinks. And I think some of it is just kind of political ineptness, to be honest, kind of mystery. It felt as if they were kind of making it up as they went along a bit for large parts of this autumn, and that's why they ended up with these sort of slightly contradictory stories about the OBR and what was said to who and by when. And I think she's permanently weakened figure. She ought to have resigned earlier this year and said, I can't do what needs to be done because of the backbench of the Labour Party, and preserved some kind of credibility for the future. But she's doomed now. It's only a matter of time, I think.
Do you think that's true, Chris? Do you think their days are numbered? Was it just no alternative to her or Starmer, I suppose?
No, that's an alternative, but it'd be almost certainly worse. I mean, there's a potentially better alternative. There are slightly better people in the Labour Party, I guess, but the Labour membership won't vote for them. The Labour membership would rather have Zach Polanski, I would think, a large number of them.
Well, they're a funny bunch because they did go from voting for Jeremy Corbyn to voting for Keir Starmer. And I know he did kind of pose as kind of Corbynism, but with a suit and tie on. But people knew that he was not really a kind of creature of
I don't think it's
left in
I
the
don't
same
think
way.
anyone knew what he was at all. I'm not sure he knows what he is. The way he, I hate to use the word, but lied to the membership about what he was is quite astonishing, really. I said at the time, if he's going to lie to the membership like this, how can we be sure he's not lying to the public? I don't think it's even a matter of lying. I think it's simply a matter of not knowing what he believes at all. He's a cipher. People used to accuse Tony Blair of being quite a fake person, but he was like Margaret Thatcher in his views compared to Keir Starmer. I imagine they'll get replaced because they'll just do so badly in the polls that people think that anything's better. But I believe Ed Miliband is a favourite to replace some amongst Labour members at the moment, which just tells you how clueless Labour members are.
Not only a bad idea, but also kind of busted flush, which is kind of
Yeah, he's had a
telling.
go at the job before.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
And it was
Might as well bring Corbyn back.
widely mocked for having failed in such spectacular fashion. You mentioned Blair there, Chris, and I wonder if we should pivot to one part of the Labour agenda which feels very Blairite, which is in relation to civil liberties. Digital ID has obviously been a big centerpiece policy for them. It was one of those ones that I think they thought they were going to bring it in, and obviously they probably bought a lot of the claims made about how this was going to single-handedly, solve illegal migration or streamline the welfare system or whatever. But also I think they thought, we've got a bankable popular policy. You poll people before the announcement and it commanded pretty solid support. You poll people since the announcement and it has dropped precipitously.
Because it's associated with Keir Starmer.
Exactly, the reverse Midas touch. I mean, Dave, just on digital ID itself, what do you think? What was your response when you saw that they were wheeling this one out again for the 800th time?
I mean, I'm totally against it. I mean, I resigned from government over vaccine certification, which I thought crossed the similar sort of line. And I think people don't always understand the difference between a digital ID and like an ID card. I don't like ID cards, but an ID card it's like a passport. It's a bit of paper that says who you are. A digital ID is a way of the government controlling you because they can set the conditions that you get it. They can set the conditions that you use it for, and they can change it overnight. And that's what I find so troubling about this and frustrating that people can't see it. But this is a very controlling government. They like controlling speech. They like controlling, all sorts of lifestyle, aspects of how you try to live. So it's not surprising. I mean, no doubt the British bureaucracy will make a terrible mess of this. That is the one kind of redeeming feature that I think they may find it too difficult to do in the time they've got available. Let's hope so. But I just, I find this so worrying, this direction of travel towards policing activities, policing what you can say, and this reduction of the sort of space that people have where they don't have to think about the government and they can just get on with their lives. That space is kind of shrinking all the time.
And it was funny because one of Keir Starmer's sort of watchwords at one point was that we need a politics that treads more lightly on your lives, which I think he meant getting rid of the Conservatives or whatever. But it was still the fact that we had digital ID. Speech is another one where, for instance, this Islamophobia definition, which would effectively, we wouldn't be talking about a law per se saying you cannot say this or that or you'd be thrown in the clink, but it would have downward pressure on speech in relation to it be a definition that councils and so on would have to uphold. Do you think it's very likely that whether it's via this definition or via future bits of legislation, speech could end up being a fair bit less free by the end of this government?
I mean, I do. I mean, the Islamophobia thing, of course, we don't know what it says. They've been consulting some people, not others. That's the problem. And it will definitely have a chilling effect, whatever it is, that's for sure. The problem is that we've got a load of laws already on the statutory book from the 80s and 90s, the Public Order Act, the Malicious Communications Act, all this sort of terrible stuff, that we kind of lived with because there wasn't the digital world, but also because we did kind of have a culture of free speech, and it was thought to be a feature of British politics, and politicians cared about it up to a point. You need people like that. And now we simply do not have that culture. And all these acts that we could live with in a different world have now become extremely dangerous. They can be used at will. They're very broadly drafted. The establishment, the sort of progressive establishment, is a real believer in disinformation. This kind of thing that people are too stupid to make their own minds up about things. There's this constant flood of misleading information out there, which I find ironic because most disinformation comes from governments, not from individuals. And this is the mindset that's taking us in that direction. And we will win the odd victory, like over the trans issue, and more or less what you can say there. But the whole direction of travel is in the other direction of fear during this mandate.
And Chris, we talked a bit about how terrible this Starmer government has been. It seems the two consequences of that is reform going great guns, but also Zach Polanski, the Greens' kind of Corbynism revived in even zanier form. Are we slightly underselling? Because we've been laughing a lot at Zach Polanski, but he could potentially be a significant threat, not just to the Labour Party, but to a lot of the issues that we care about.
He's definitely a threat to the Labour Party, as is your party if they ever properly get going. So really, the rise of the far left is a good thing for reform, and to some extent, I guess, the Conservative Party. I mean, the Green Party under Zach Polanski, it's very difficult to be polite about it because it's such a clown show. And the things he says are so stupid, frankly. You try and deal with people in good faith, but there isn't any way of dealing with Zach Polanski without just saying what you're saying is idiotic. It's just idiotic. And it's depressing if 15% of the population let's assume that they've actually listened to what he says. It's not just a yelp of indignation against the Labour Party. If they really think that these policies are good, it's really depressing. It's what I call the lobotomy left. And these, the wealth tax is a bad idea, right, for various reasons, but you can kind of see why some people would go along with it. Magic monetary policy, magic monetary, which we mentioned recently in the podcast, modern monetary theory is an idea without any redeeming features. It's just absolutely preposterous. And yet that seems to be part of his agenda. And he's just, I think, just a ridiculous person. I know his supporters will be saying, "Oh, Snowden's rattled by this," But I think when someone does get to that kind of, fairly respectable levels in the polls, it's reasonable to stop ignoring them and start responding to them. But the only way you can respond to someone like that, I'm afraid, is to say you're just a dunce.
And that has started in earnest, dare I say. I mean, with his appearance on The Rest Is Politics, we didn't know the difference between the debt and the deficit. And he cited, what's the name, Grace Blakely as one of his favourite economists. So if you know who Grace Blakely is, you know that that's ridiculous for various different reasons, both in terms of her own credentials and what it is that she says. And also, of course, his turn on Question Time, where his great moral stand for immigration was that I would rather not be wiping people's bums. So I'm glad that someone...
Yeah, he
is
took a
doing
lot of
so.
stick for that, didn't he? I didn't actually think that was by any means the worst thing he said on Question Time, but it's interesting that he manages to rile the centre-left as well as the centre-right at the same time. I think he's a disaster waiting to happen for the Green Party. It's a very funny party, the Green Party. You look at the leadership even, right? You've got this guy, Polanski, who ex-Lib Dem, now basically a MMT communist. And then you've got is it the deputy leader? Who shouted Allah Akbar when he won his seat. And then you've got the other deputy leader, who, as far as I can tell, is just some kind of middle-aged woman who probably joined the Green Party because she was concerned about the ozone layer. And she doesn't know what to make of it. It's a weird kind of electoral coalition in the Green Party. And I'm not sure how many of their members are going to be happy with Polanski's fairy tale economics and communism. Probably most of them, to be fair.
What have you made of Zach Polanski's strange rise, David?
I mean,
Of
pretty much the
bemusement,
same
yeah.
as, yeah. I mean, it's hard to know what to say, and I guess it's the symptom of the fragmentation of British politics generally. We have sort of proportional representation type politics and parties now without actually having proportional representation, and it was having two big parties that kind of controlled the extremes and crank ideas at either end, and now we don't have that, and kind of out they come. Or whether, as the election approaches, we'll see them, electoral pressures will push them back into the mainstream. I think that's possible on the left anyway. I don't know, but I don't find it surprising that his ideas land, because nobody's talked about what makes an economy work properly for 20 years. So it's not surprising that people are prey to all these nutty ideas.
And on the points of multi-party politics, I heard on the radio the other week that they were saying, talking about the polling numbers, it's like, and out of all the four main parties, and you thought, isn't that fascinating? Like the fact that even without even realizing it, people are starting to talk.
Well, the interesting thing about
terms.
the tactical voting, which of course is always a big thing, particularly on the left, it only works if you're trying to penalise one party.
Yes.
Right? So you can have tactical voters in the next election trying to keep out reform, but is that going to let the Tories in? It doesn't really work in a four-party system, the tactical voting. So it'd be very interesting to see how that plays out. I'm still predicting a hung parliament with a Labour reform coalition.
Yeah,
but my political
so what Farage is like the
my political
deputy or the
predictions,
Prime
as you
Minister?
probably know, are historically appalling.
Labour reform, is it?
Not Labour, no. Did I say Labour?
You said Labour, yeah.
Oh, sorry, no.
Yeah.
Tory.
I thought it was a
Tory
joke.
Reform. No, Tory reform.
Yeah, Tory reform. No, that could well be. I think any kind of option is underpriced at this point. Things could go in any direction. I want to return a little bit to what's going to happen with the right, David. But given you were the chief Brexit negotiator, we would be remiss if we didn't ask you about how Brexit has been managed under Keir Starmer. Back in May, I think, there was this big landmark agreement on agri-food, effectively saying that we're going to unwind Brexit in that area and align with single market rules as it relates to that. There's since then been all this wrangling over defence questions, youth mobility, and so on and so forth. But particularly with this speech that Keir Starmer made recently, was quite openly talking again about Brexit being a mistake, a pup that was sold to the electorate and so on and so forth. Are we just doomed for more of this kind of unravelling of what people voted for?
I mean, I think we are doomed to that direction of travel again. That's clear. I mean, of course, Labour rhetoric could shift again. Keir can't be relied on for more than a couple of weeks on one subject. But I think the important thing about the government's direction of travel on this is that they are not driven by the economics, really. They claim to be, and talk about the bad trade deal and all this sort of stuff, but really, they just really regard Brexit as some sort of horrific diversion of history, some awful historical mistake that somehow Britain did and needs to be corrected, and that's really how they see it, and that's what gives them the energy to keep pursuing it, I think. And I think they kind of kidded themselves into believing that it was a bad trade deal and could easily be improved, neither of which is true. What they've realized is that the only way you can improve it is by doing what we refused to do when we were in power, which is subject yourselves to EU laws and the court as the price of reducing friction. And they don't really want to admit that, and they certainly don't want to admit the implications of it. They know probably they can only push so far on that. And that's why we've got where we are, these sort of trivial economic gains that give away points of principle because they're not really interested. They just want to set the direction of travel that, one day will take us back in, or at least closer. And if they have to do terrible deals on the way, well, they don't really mind about that.
And do you think they're getting a bit of a kind of crash course in what the European Union is actually like to negotiate with? Because I think they came in and thought, these are our kind of people. Of course, they want to bring us closer into the fold, but they're now kind of meeting the hard reality of the fact that the only terms, it seems like, particularly the kind of big players in Europe, will have us back in, even in a kind of meagre sector by sector form, is as the supplicant, and they've been incredibly intransigent even on the things you think there'd be some agreement over, like defence and so on. I mean, are they kind of the scales falling from their eyes, do you think?
I mean, I hope so. And they did walk away. I was a bit surprised they walked away from this safe deal, this defence procurement deal that's telling us that the bill was too big. We'll see if that sticks. I wouldn't be surprised if they come back to it at some point in the next 2 or 3 months. But they did at least, there was a point that they wouldn't be pushed beyond, which is good. an important signal. So, but generally, I think they were just incredibly naive. I think they thought, we're all friends here and it'll all be okay. And the EU just does not behave like that. It just, it is incredibly ruthless about the way it negotiates. And one of the failings that the British government under Theresa May made was that it didn't adjust its psychology. The EU adjusted really quickly to saying Britain is effectively a third country. We have to push them as hard as we can. We just didn't, and we're still in all the meetings, still a member while trying to leave. And obviously that was going to be a mess. And May learned her lesson eventually. I don't think Starmer has yet learned the lesson, but hopefully he's learning at least.
I mean, could you ever see a situation in which rejoining in any meaningful sense is kind of back on the table for the Labour Party? Because we've been talking a bit in this conversation, also on the last episode, about how Starmer seems to be pursuing a bit more of a kind of core vote strategy now. I mean, that kind of period in which there was a desire to win back some of the people who were going towards reform or hold on to some of the more kind of red wall voters that they managed to claw back just about the last election. That seems to have hit the skids, and now it's very much about going back to the combination of, students in metropolitan centres and the kind of professional managerial class. In a context in which they're fighting for their lives, could you see a situation in which they might say, you know what, we actually do want to get, if not full rejoin, then a lot closer to Europe, and that becomes a battleground for the next?
I mean, I could. This is the other half of their core vote strategy, I guess. The progressive, sort of metro liberal half of it. You sort of double down on that instead, and it makes political sense up to a point, I think, for them. A lot of, who knows how politics is going to go, and a lot of things got to go in a particular way. But I think it's entirely possible you could end up with a commitment to have a referendum in the next manifesto of the next election. I don't think we could rejoin without a referendum, given everything that's happened. I think that would be quite tricky now. I also think it's possible they could try and take us back into the customs union or a lot more of the single market by stealth between now and then. I know they've got a manifesto pledge about not joining the customs union and the single market, but they never will admit to what they've done. They'll say, we've got a special and deep customs partnership with the European Union or something, and it will be dressed up slightly differently and the treaty will look different, but everyone will agree to obfuscate and pretend it isn't really the customs union, but that's what it will be. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I could imagine that it could go in that direction.
What about you, Chris? Do you reckon Starmer could go full Ramona again for the sake of...
I think Poppy Coburn from the Telegraph suggested this on Newsnight, that the Labour Party should go full rejoin.
Sort of rile up the progressives.
I think it's a trap. I would suggest. I can only assume it's a trap. I mean, I don't know how anyone really cares about Brexit anymore, to be honest. If you look at the polls, you ask people what the top three things they're worried about, 50% immigration, 50% economy, then NHS, loads of, like, the Brexit, the relations with the EU are right at the bottom, about 13% of people. It's just an obsession for a small and weird minority at this point. Anybody reasonable can see that Brexit has not made a great deal of difference one way or the other. There's a few marginal benefits, there's a few marginal negatives. It hasn't had much of an effect. And the people who spent 4 years absolutely wetting the bed about this, because it was the worst thing that was ever happened, that fascism is on the rise, we're never going to be trading with anyone ever again, the planes are going to fall out of the sky, all this kind of nonsense of IRA going to be back in Northern Ireland. You just have to think back to the ridiculous.
It would be a win for ISIS and Putin, as David Cameron said. So that was good.
I mean, it was such an awful time to be on social media with these people, just moaning like crazy. None of it happened. I'm not saying it's all been a success, but there have been some successes from it. I think on balance, it's been a good thing, actually. But I, as a Brexit voter, I never thought it was going to make a massive difference. And one of the reasons, aside from all the inflation and the problems of COVID, the Tories got kicked out in 2024, is that it obviously didn't make this dramatic difference that some people thought it was going to make. I always thought this was a sort of generational project. And the best thing about it is that we wouldn't be tied into future directives from the EU, that we could duck out, which we already are doing with things like AI and genetic meat, genetically produced, whatever it's called, artificially produced meat and so on. These are pretty marginal benefits, but they are benefits, and over time, I believe they will grow bigger. But why anybody would be thinking now in late 2025, the thing we really need to do is reopen this massive wound, get everybody arguing about it again for another few years, and then presumably get a much worse deal involving taking the euro and all the rest of this stuff. It's not going to happen. I mean, if they had another referendum, we would not rejoin. I'm quite confident about that. I don't care what the polls say now about it. Once people have to start thinking about what that actually involves, probably losing the pound, almost certainly losing the pound, amongst other things, it's not going to happen. Just let it go, lads. Things weren't as bad. Things weren't as bad as you said it was going to be. You're right. They weren't as good as Dan Hanan said they were going to be either. But basically, it's a wash, and things are okay. Let's focus on the real problems facing the country, because we've got a perfectly good trade deal, thanks to this, Matt. And we've also got trade deals with India and America, which we'd have to tear up
No, exactly.
if we rejoin the EU. Just let sleeping dogs lie. Maybe in 50 years, we'll have another referendum. How about that?
Exactly. See that in the manifesto. And maybe this, David, slightly preempts the conversation we're about to have about the right and what they might do if they maybe get back into power or get into power for the first time in form of reform. But if you were to improve upon the kind of benefits of Brexit, beyond unwinding everything that the Labour Party have been doing, what would you suggest that any government, I guess, pursue to make more of a fist of this?
I mean, the main thing that needs to happen, which needs to happen anyway, is more market liberalisation and a smaller state and lower taxes, and beginning to dismantle some of the regulatory states that built up during the period of EU membership, and even some in the EU are arguing that about the EU now. So it definitely needs to happen. I think the big issue, and I'm not sure they know it yet, is Northern Ireland, because obviously Northern Ireland is still part of the single market for goods and customs union de facto, and it means that every bit of liberalisation and change in Great Britain opens up the gap with Northern Ireland. So future government of the right's got to decide, is it okay with that, or is it going to reopen the Northern Ireland question? And both of those choices are kind of unsatisfactory. I think they have massive cons as well as pros, and I think that is a really hard decision. I personally would favour finding some way of reopening and at least a direction of travel that starts to remove, bring back Northern Ireland to kind of normal UK governance. But for the reasons you're giving, Chris, the appeal of saying, what, if we win, we're going to war with the EU again over Northern Ireland, it's a hard sell, and you've got to have a really strong reason for it. So I know where I stand on that, but I could see the politics of this is quite difficult. But if you don't tackle it, you do have this massive built-in inhibition to doing what's necessary, which the rest of the EU doesn't have.
So let's talk a little bit about the right, not least because now you're unaffiliated, even freer to talk, no longer a Tory peer, an unaffiliated peer. Obviously, Reform have been leading in more than 100 polls now. Given the nature of our politics at the moment, they could easily win a majority on that or could easily fall short. It's quite uncertain. The Tories, whilst had been, broadly speaking, sort of written off for a large part of this year, are starting to find their feet a little bit more under Kemi Badenoch, but that's arguably from a bit of a low base, dare we say. But what's been particularly telling is how politically there is a kind of clear story emerging amongst both parties, broadly speaking. They're quite in the Tory case, they're quite clearly kind of repudiating a lot of the things, net zero, soft, high migration, what have you, that they put in place during a long time in office, and Reform, the kind of set of issues that everyone has come to associate with them in terms of hardlining immigration, taking on a lot of these cultural war issues, and so on and so forth. Where do you think the kind of, I suppose, how do you see this settling? What advice would you give to anyone who's looking to push back on this Labour government in terms of what they should be focusing on, what will get them elected and get them over the line?
Yeah, I guess, I think in a way, the kind of competition on the right has turned out to be quite a good thing. And, in fact, both parties are heading in the same direction, really. As you say, Tories are dismantling a lot of what we built up and sort of chasing reform on some issues, arguably overtaking on one or two, like immigration, who knows. But I think the direction of travel is clear, and I'm not sure if we hadn't had that competition, I'm not sure it would have been quite so clear a drift to the right. So that's a good thing. I mean, I think that the open issue is which party is more serious about kind of economic reform and liberalisation and market reform, and there's a question mark, I suppose, about reform. Tories trying to position themselves. The big problem Tories have still got, and I get it every time I do an interview and every time I talk to people, is why should we believe you this time? Look what a mess you made. That's and I think, and it may not be possible to get over that, in which case the party has a serious problem. The only way I think you might be able to get over it is to define what the party stands for and kick out the people on the left. I think only a small group, but they exist, who won't support it. The sort of social liberal Lib Dem opinion on the left of the party. That is the one visible thing that can be done to say this is a different party. It won't happen again. It may not be enough and it may not work, but I think unless you do that, it's really hard to persuade people that this is a different party and going to go in the right direction. You're giving reform a permanent advantage there. So that would be my advice to Kemi for what it's worth. And but I think it may be too late for her to take it if it's not too late for her necessarily. So that's my view.
Yeah, and then Chris, what have you made of the sort of reform side of the ledger here in terms of what's been going on in the right? Because obviously they've been having a fair amount of polling success. They've been picking up, council by-election seats and obviously Westminster seats as well. There's been a lot of thrills and spills as well, and a lot of question marks over what it is they're beyond the issue of immigration, what it is they're actually going to stand for, I suppose. So what have you made of them over the course of the past year? Have they reassured you that there might be a government in waiting, or have they left you with more questions?
No, not yet, but I'm hopeful that they are putting together a sensible manifesto and looking at these things properly. The main job of the next government, whoever it is to repeal. It's not about tax cuts per se. It's about regulation. I think actually most people if you ask people in think tanks, more or less across the political spectrum, they will agree on certain things, which could save the country tens of billions of pounds. The send issue, the disability benefits, incapacity benefits, PIP, call it what you will, and our old favourite planning. I mean, these are just things where there would be no black holes at all if we just dealt with these issues. Unfortunately, Labour is not dealing with them. But they are there and they're so easy to deal with. I mean, as a very simple baseline, actually, of just getting things rocking again would be, let's go back to 2019. Not 6 years ago. Just go back to 2019. What were we doing in 2019 that we're not doing now? Well, we hadn't messed up the disability incentives, the incentives for claiming long-term disability. The massive mistake by the Tories, never been fully understood by most people, and apparently by the current government. But we are hugely incentivizing young people in particular, but working age people in general, to claim fraudulently, basically, I would say, long-term disability. That has had a massive effect on the economy, not just in terms of paying out vast sums of money in benefits, but in, of course, them not working. Which has a human cost on them as well, but also means they're not paying income tax. I mean, that one thing, just taking back the welfare system that we had 6 years ago, would make a massive difference. The send, Motability, all this kind of nonsense, again, Tories are to blame, fine, revert to what it was previously. This is not radical stuff. This is not radical IEA free market stuff. This is just, it's been tinkered with in a disastrous way, tinker it back again, And that's before we get to much more radical things to do with the NHS and education and planning system and all the rest of it. The answers are there. That's what's so frustrating. The answers are there, and I think this government knows what they are. They just won't do them. Triple lock is another one. Some of these things are more politically difficult than others. I understand that, but some of them actually would be really quite popular. The two-child benefit cap was a popular policy. As we said before on the podcast, it's a popular policy even with Labour voters. Why are you not doing it? Because you're beholden to your backbenchers. It's ridiculous. The IEA, we've got a grander vision of what a much smaller state would be, but a slightly smaller state could be so easily achieved without ruffling any feathers, really. And everyone deep down knows what needs to be done.
Yeah, I agree. I think, in my head, you actually need 2 terms to do what's necessary. I think that, and in the first term, you get spending back down to where it was in Gordon Brown's era. That's how bad things are and how much better things could be. And in the second term, you get it back to the early Blair era. And most people seem to think that Britain under early Blair was quite good. Certainly on the left, people were okay with it. It's not like, radical small state, night watchman state world. It's just a sort of, it's just where we were, and it's not impossible to get back there. And I think the sort of cuts you're describing, Chris, and the sort of retrenchment, that's your first term. And then the second term, if you can prove that you can deserve it, then you need to go further.
Yeah.
And
First term, try and get back to 2007. Second term, try and get back to 1997.
yeah,
None of this is really that radical,
no,
because it's within our lifetimes. We can remember the time. And even at the time, a lot of people go like, well, the country's too left wing. We're spending too much money. But now Blair, even in 2007, when he'd been splurging a huge amount of money on all sorts of things, particularly the NHS, people on our side of the divide were going like, oh, God, I wish it was like Blair again. I wish it was 18 years ago.
yeah. I think
That's
really
how bad
think,
things are.
and I think also a lot of people have forgotten what it's like to live in a growing economy, because we've had sort of this 20 years of where everything's been getting worse, growth's been getting slower. I'm old enough to remember what it was like in the Thatcher era and the 90s and the early Blair eras up to about 2005, and it just felt different. It felt like you could do things, you could aspire to build things, and you could sort of make yourself better off, and you had choices, and all that's kind of closed in, and we've had it for so long that if you're under 40, you think that's just normal. You kind of know it isn't, but you've no real reference point to remember what it was like when it was different. And we've got to get some of these animal spirits back and enthusiasm for what you can do with your life. It's just been closed off, and people are kind of giving up, and it's so depressing.
And just finally, Dave, before we move on to our final couple of questions, there's been a bit more conversation in the past week about, at least when we're recording this, it's coming out a few weeks hence, about uniting the right, about reform and the Tories in some kind of pact. Farage reportedly talking to donors about, if there is going to be an agreement, it will be a kind of reverse takeover and so on and so forth. This is all very up in the air. But is that something that you think is going to be, at the very least, more of a discussion point as we go forward? Because Reform have been doing tremendously well, certainly from where they started the last election. But given the fact that they are still kind of bumping around somewhere between high 20s and low 30s, the question about, why not stick those two parties together in some way, informal or formal, has become more of an issue. So do you see that as becoming more of a question as we go into the new year?
And I think it'll become a question as the election approaches. I don't know whether 2026 is that year, because there isn't going to be an early election. I don't think. Take complete catastrophe.
Labour on that stupid.
No, exactly. I mean, the one thing the last Tory government MPs could all agree on until Rishi blew it was there wasn't going to be an election until the last possible moment, and the same will be true of Labour. So, as a matter of analysis, as the election approaches, if we are divided, then we're going to lose. Therefore, either one party has to absorb the other, or one party has to kill the other, or there has to be some kind of understanding or coalition. One of those things has got to happen, or we lose again. And I guess, the relative votes and the politics as we get a bit closer will determine which one of those actually happens. I mean, I think at the moment, Reform has not shown the ability to get into the last kind of lager of the Conservative Party of sort of socially liberal, affluent voters in places like Oxfordshire, Hampshire, around London, wealthy property owners. I'm not sure they can tackle them. So I find it quite plausible that the Tories could go quite a long time with sort of 15 to 20% of the vote. And therefore, we're confronted with this question on the right. But I just don't think it will be urgent this year unless something surprising happens.
Mm-hmm. So before we let you get out of here, David, we've got two questions to ask you. First of all, do you have a theory So just to give a kind of bit of outline for this is Chris's segment where he likes to occasionally kind of put forward, I wouldn't go as far as call it a conspiracy theory, but just a
No,
kind
not
of pet
conspiracy.
theory one has about
A
why certain
quirky
things-
theory.
Yeah.
Eccentric theory.
The classic example I use is that your idea, Chris, that in the absence of people smoking so much at home and the demise of the domestic deep fat fryer, that all fires are arson, all house fires are arson, I should say.
I think nearly all fires are arson these days.
Yeah. So is there anything like that, David, that has ever struck
So
you?
I was thinking about this, and actually, it comes back to what we were saying about kind of green left-wing politics, because I think there's this kind of assumption, that and lifestyle food faddism, sort of things you talk about, Chris. There's this kind of assumption that if you're on the left, is that drives you into kind of veganism, obsession with what you eat
Yeah.
and its origins and all this sort of thing. And my kind of semi-serious theory, but the more I think about it, the more I think it might be correct, is it's actually the other way around. And it's the availability of all sorts of kind of food fads, lactose-free, gluten-free, whatever, super sort of that drives left-wing politics. And there's kind of, what's the mechanism? There are two possible mechanisms here. One is that as your own life, what you eat and so on becomes so bound by rules and getting it absolutely right that you politics that's also about rules and imposing it on you becomes more attractive. But there is another theory, which I think we need more research into, which is that it'll turn out that something like lactose or gluten is actually very closely linked to cognitive powers.
Good for the brain.
If you don't have it, then they weaken.
Yeah, meat and milk
that
feeds the brain.
that's the appeal of Zach Polanski. And the good thing
It
is
also explains that.
yeah, exactly.
Himself a vegan, yes.
And
I
the good thing
buy
is that
that,
we
yeah.
can, the policy consequence is clear then, which is that, no more oat milk at Starbucks and no more gluten-free options.
Ban
and more
Linda
ultra-processed
McCartney
food.
sausages.
Yeah.
Which the
Solves
EU is
the
in fact
problem.
going to do.
Yeah, that's right.
You seen that
Plot
stuff?
twist, yeah. It's all of it.
Can't call them sausages anymore.
And very, very finally, David, given that we are a very libertarian anti-ban podcast, we do like to ask our guests, if you had to have one ban, what would it be?
You are a dictator.
This is your second appearance, so it'll technically be your
Yeah,
second
last
ban.
time you said people wearing dark clothes in winter.
That's
Yeah,
right.
no,
So
exactly.
look
We came out.
yeah.
I'm pleased to see you got a
specifically for
colourful
this,
tie
Well,
on.
at least.
But what else has irked you of late that you might
Yeah,
want to crack
okay.
down
It's, you may have had this before, but it's bikes in London
on?
and big cities. That's why. Have you had this before?
No, I
you might
maybe
not-
not as explicitly, but like around the edges. But yes, this is a very popular.
People-
I bet this will be a popular.
People
choice.
moving around in London at all is being pretty heavily coloured.
It's very
In any
countercultural
in
nowadays.
any form of
That's true.
transport.
I mean, London streets were not built for cars and bikes, and since we need cars, therefore there's only one option. We'll know about the kind of irritation of cycle lanes and drivers, but that's not really my argument. My argument is that cycles kind of kill aspiration. They're behind some of the decline in the economy. You don't need much money to buy a bike. You need a lot of money to buy a car. Therefore, it's stopping people. It's a disincentive to working hard and getting on. It's a visible sign of decline, like all these as well, sort of rickshaws and scooters and this sort of thing. It's a visible sign of de-development. In China, 50 years ago, everyone had a bike. Now they have a car. We're going backwards.
We're going
and
the opposite direction.
it's discouraging
Yeah.
people.
That's a good point.
Bikes are disproportionately dangerous to young people because they're the ones who ride them. We already don't have enough young people, therefore we can't afford to lose any more with pointless.
The bikes and the
They are
life bike.
killed by
It's not
cars,
great.
to be fair.
Some of them.
Jeremy Vine would say,
The more
it's the
bikes we have,
devil's
the
advocate.
more there'll be. It'll make it harder to do illegal working because if delivery workers have got
It's
to
very
find
true.
a car,
Yes, we have
they
had
will not-
delivery workers
not
on,
be able
on
to
this
do
spot
that.
before, yeah.
and it's just a sort of fundamentally childish thing. And I think one of the problems we've got is that this sort of relationship with the government, the government's parent, and we're all kind of children given pocket money. And I think things like bikes kind of
Bikes are for children,
reinforce this.
fundamentally, aren't
They are. And St. Paul said, when I became a child, I gave up childish things. He didn't say I gave up childish things and bought more expensive childish things through China and Vietnam. So if you want a bike, buy a car, put the bike in the back and go to Surrey and ride it there. That's my view.
That's a perfect advice for anyone who wants to enjoy their new year. Merry Christmas.
Hard to do. Hard to argue with that.
Exactly. Merry Christmas to all of our listeners and viewers. Hope you have a wonderful new year. Get off your bike, as it were, and make sure that you get your hands on a copy of this Vibe Shift, Brendan O'Neill's new book. It's coming out in the new year. But if you want to get a signed copy, go to spiked-online.com/Xmas and make your donation. Thanks so much. We'll see you in 2026. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Last Orders. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you never miss another Spiked video. If you're listening to this on your podcast app, make sure you subscribe there and give us a glowing 5-star review. And if you'd like to get in touch with your questions or band suggestions, email us at lastorders@spiked-online.com.